Thank you for that very thorough introduction, and thank you to the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute and the University of Vienna for inviting All Survivors Project to participate in this conference. Perhaps I can just briefly present the organization. So All Survivors Project is an international human rights NGO working to support global efforts to eradicate conflict-related sexual violence and strengthen national and international responses thereto, primarily through research and action on sexual violence affecting men and boys, including those with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and all sex characteristics, as well as other people with diverse SOGI-esque. We work primarily in three areas. Firstly, to strengthen prevention measures in relation to sexual violence against men and boys. Secondly, improving access to justice for male survivors, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. And thirdly, improving the availability of and access to timely, quality, survivor-centered medical and humanitarian responses for male survivors. So without further ado, the focus of my remarks today is going to be the investigation and prosecution of male-directed sexual violence as a core international crime and the importance of adopting a gendered analysis to such crimes. Now, this is a big and complex topic, so I'm only going to focus on certain aspects. I'll first begin by making some general observations about understanding male-directed sexual violence and about accountability for survivors. And secondly, I will share some insights from ASP's experience of working with male survivors in Colombia. So for the last 12 months, we've been investigating and documenting incidents and patterns of sexual violence against men and boys by the FARC, the paramilitary, and the state security forces in Colombia, amounting, we say, to war crimes and crimes against humanity. And our findings are going to form part of a filing to the Special Jurisdiction for Peace on behalf of over 70 survivors. For those of you who don't know, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace is a criminal tribunal which was established under the 2016 peace agreement between the government and the FARC. And together with the Truth Commission, it forms an integral part of Colombia's transitional justice architecture. And the jurisdiction is tasked with investigating, prosecuting, and adjudicating the most serious and representative conflict-related crimes perpetrated prior to 2016. So starting with male-directed sexual violence in general terms. I think it's fair to say that sexual violence against men and boys has historically been unacknowledged, and that compared to women and girls, there remains fairly limited understanding of the phenomenon of male-directed sexual violence, of its prevalence, of its varied nature and impacts, and of the differing needs of male survivors. So what do we know? Well, All Survivors Project has documented sexual violence against men and boys in over 35 armed conflicts since the 90s, including in the Balkans, in Sri Lanka, in the Central African Republic, in Syria, and in Colombia. Forms of male-directed sexual violence typically include rape, either by a single or multiple perpetrators, including forced fellatio, genital mutilation or torture, such as the application of electric shocks to genitalia, forced nudity, forced witnessing and or forced perpetration of sexual violence towards others, in particular family members, and forced marriage and sexual slavery, for example, in the case of children associated with armed groups. Now, I just wanted to flag at this juncture that international criminal law, of course, adopts a gender-neutral approach to sexual violence. So if we take the Rome Statute as an example, rape and other forms of sexual violence are defined in a gender-neutral manner, in that both males and females can be recognized as victims and perpetrators, which is not always the case in domestic jurisdiction. And the acts that I've just mentioned may, depending on the circumstances, constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or be underlying elements of genocide. Sexual violence can also be an underlying act of persecution as a crime against humanity and a form of torture, constituting all three of these core international crimes. Now, there are contexts in which men and boys are particularly at risk of being targeted. These include situations of deprivation of liberty. This is something that we've seen massively, for instance, in Syria, as well as within the ranks of armed forces or armed groups, and with regards to boys specifically in the context of child recruitment. So we know that it happens, and we know that the consequences can be devastating. Yet what we see is that the system response for sexual violence, including the justice response, to the extent that there is one, is almost exclusively focused on women and girls. And so in practice, medical, humanitarian, but also justice actors are often blind to the extent to which men and boys can also be victimized and have little to no training in working with male survivors. So as a consequence, they're often ill-equipped to identify or respond to the differing and specific needs of these populations. So what that means on the ground is that the experiences of male survivors when it comes to sexual violence are largely eclipsed and invisibilized, including in accountability processes. Now, this is due to a confluence of interlinked and mutually reinforcing factors, and I'll just mention a couple. So the first major barrier is underreporting due to a lack of self-identification, because it's often a challenge for male survivors to recognize their experience as one of sexual violence. What we also see is that there are a number of social and structural barriers to disclosure. So for instance, legal systems in many countries that fail to recognize male sexual violence altogether, or that expose male victims to a risk of criminalization. We also see stigmatizing attitudes and behaviors from service providers, for instance, homophobic attitudes, or providers who simply lack the knowledge and the skills to adequately recognize and respond to male survivors. Now, these barriers, as many things in life, are rooted in harmful gender norms and stereotypes. Because in most societies, masculinity is associated with power and dominance, and this is reflected in gender discrimination against women and girls and LGBTI+ persons. So under heteronormative patriarchy, sexual vulnerability is ideologically gendered. And so what that means is that female bodies are positioned as naturally sexually vulnerable and male bodies as naturally sexually invulnerable. And it's also the case that the heteronormative patriarchal ideologies underlying sexual violence serves to facilitate a particular form of stigma against male victims, namely the stigma of being a homosexual, which in many countries today is still something that's transgressive, which leads to even more underreporting and can explain some of the stigmatizing attitudes that male survivors face. Now, these gender norms and stereotypes impact the law and its application and manifest in justice processes, both at the national and international levels. So what we see, for instance, is that the limited recognition and understanding of male-directed sexual violence means that the skills for documenting and investigating these crimes tend to be underdeveloped. Most of the tools and the guidance for documenters and investigators are still designed with a male perpetrator and a female victim in mind. So this translates into a blind spot and a tendency not to include male survivors in investigation plans and evidence gathering strategies. So the information and evidence that is out there, we just either don't think to look for it or we don't know how to. And this is really in sharp contrast to what we see with women and girls, where the need to adopt a gendered analysis of international crimes and to investigate and prosecute sexual violence against women and girls is becoming increasingly ingrained in the accountability enterprise. Now, I fully recognize that this is at times more at a theoretical level, rather than a substantive level. And, you know, as Stephanie's remarks have illustrated, we still have a long, long way to go. Nevertheless, there has been a huge amount of progress in the last 3 decades. And the same cannot be said for men and boys, despite the fact that they too are vulnerable to sexual violence. When male-directed sexual violence is surfaced, the approach of accountability mechanisms has been inconsistent. So if you look at the ad hoc tribunals and the ICC, for instance, what we see in several cases is either mischaracterizing sexual violence or exclusively characterizing sexual violence as torture or cruel treatment or other inhumane acts as a crime against humanity. So I'm thinking, for example, of the Kenyatta case, where the pretrial chamber in that case decided to characterize the forced circumcision of men as other inhumane acts rather than acts of sexual violence. So this mischaracterization obscures the sexualized nature of the act. It fails to fully recognize the range of harm caused to victims, and it reinforces the belief that men are sexually invulnerable. And it also means that we miss the reasons why targeting men in this way might be of strategic importance to a perpetrator. Because as the prosecutor explained in that particular case, these attacks, and I quote, weren't just attacks on men's sexual organs as such, but were intended as attacks on men's identities, as men within their societies, and designed to destroy their masculinity. And we all too often simply miss that analysis. Now, turning to our experience in Colombia and how these issues sort of play out in that context. So just very briefly, first in terms of background, sexual violence, it's widely acknowledged, has been used on a widespread and systematic basis by all sides during the Colombian armed conflict. Women and girls have been disproportionately affected, and a number of organizations have done excellent work over the years when it comes to documenting patterns of sexual violence against female victims. However, often these documentation initiatives tend to overlook male survivors, even though we know that they've also been targeted. So for example, the National Victims Unit has registered around 30,000 individuals who were subjected to sexual violence between 1985 and 2016, including over 2,000 men and boys. Now, this is likely to be a gross underestimate because, as I mentioned, counting the true number of male survivors is challenging because of underreporting and because of structural and societal barriers to disclosure. So over the last 12 months, All Survivors Project has been investigating and documenting sexual violence against men and boys in partnership with a Colombian NGO in order to present a filing to the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. So something that's akin to an Article 15 communication, but perhaps a bit more grounded in criminal law methodologies. Before I detail some of what we've uncovered and what we're asking from the tribunal, I just want to briefly explain how the jurisdiction operates. So firstly, given the sheer number of crimes committed during the conflict, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace is not seeking, and it can't really, investigate every single incident. Rather, the focus is on system crimes and patterns, plans, and policies of macro criminality. Secondly, and because this is a jurisdiction that is the fruit of a peace agreement, what it does is that it adopts a mixed system of restorative and retributive justice, including by imposing alternative sanctions, including non-custodial sentences on perpetrators who at the earliest opportunity take responsibility for their crimes and provide a complete and truthful account of the violations. Now, thirdly, and relatedly, the gateway to the jurisdiction is a chamber called the Chamber for the Acknowledgement of Truth, Responsibility and Determination of Facts and Conducts. And basically, this is a body that identifies cases that fall within its jurisdiction by analyzing information presented, including by victims' organizations. And based on that analysis, it identifies potential perpetrators and invites them to acknowledge responsibility and to provide a truthful account in exchange for a reduced sentence. Now, our investigations have uncovered a number of patterns of male-directed sexual violence, including people being targeted based on an actual or imputed affiliation with the opposing group, people being targeted as a form of collective punishment and social control, including for transgressing what the perpetrators considered to be acceptable social and gender norms, particularly in the case of men of diverse sexual orientation. Sexual violence is used in Colombia against everybody, but also against men, as part of campaigns of terror designed to forcibly displace civilians, and in the context of child recruitment. So when we present the filing, we're going to be asking the chamber to investigate the incidents that we've documented, either as part of a standalone macro case on sexual violence, which is something that a lot of organizations are calling for, or in connection with other open cases, for instance, the child recruitment case. And I'll conclude my remarks with this. We're also going to be inviting the tribunal to adopt a gendered analysis of the crimes that we've documented. Because based on our experience in Colombia and elsewhere, when we think about the drivers of sexual violence, what we see is that the same logic of power and dominance that often drives sexual violence against women and girls is also at play when one is looking at male victims. So men and boys, and we've seen this in Colombia and we've seen this elsewhere, are being targeted in a very public and exemplary fashion in order to humiliate, feminize, and emasculate. So we see sexual violence being used by perpetrators in order to disempower male victims of the social authority that they hold by virtue of being male, in order to destroy their quote unquote manhood, and then by extension, to terrorize and silence the community as a whole. We also see that sexual violence is used to, and I quote, taint victims with the stigma of being homosexual, which in the Colombian context, as in many countries, is a transgression. So what we're saying to the HEP is that in order for it to fulfill its promise, it has to arrive at a more coherent and inclusive understanding of what sexual violence is and avoid some of the pitfalls that we've seen in some of these international cases. And it really has to strive to adequately conceptualize the gendered nature of sexual violence against men and boys, and understand its relationship to sexual violence against women and girls, and then recognize how that violence intersects with other factors such as race, class, and ethnicity. Our position is that any attempt to fully understand the functions and the meanings of sexual violence in a particular theatre of conflict has to include all of the victims. It has to center their voices, and it has to take seriously their understandings and the meanings of what's been done to them. If we don't do this, if you have accountability processes that don't recognize and don't punish male sexual violence, what you're doing is weakening the rule of law, perpetuating impunity, and also undermining long-term prevention efforts and reinforcing this very harmful myth about male sexual invulnerability to this type of violence. And what we're saying to the tribunal is to avoid any kind of victim hierarchy, because those hierarchies reinscribe the very ideology that we need to dismantle if we are going to eradicate sexual violence. So we're not saying, for instance, that men and boys are more shamed by sexual violence because they're less used to being targeted in this way, because that line of argument reinforces the position that women and girls are more naturally degraded. What we're saying is that you have to take into account everybody. And in doing so, that doesn't mean that you are blind to gender, and it doesn't mean that you don't recognize that the implications and consequences of sexual violence are different. But what you have to do is, on the contrary, look at the ways in which they are intersectionally gendered and make sure that that is reflected in your investigation and prosecution strategy. And I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.